So software doesn't really break. If you had a piece of perfect software, it would continue to work forever if it were kept in the same environment. The problem is in computers that the entire environment keeps changing around the software that has been written. So when a new chipset comes out, there'll be new drivers for the chipset. Operating systems get new features. They might eventually deprecate some old interfaces, create new interfaces, and so forth. So a lot of the maintenance work is, for example, just keeping up with the environment changes around the piece of software and making sure that it continues to work. A couple of Bitcoin Core releases ago, for example, we had, there was a change in Mac OS, and the new version of Mac OS couldn't start Bitcoin Core anymore. It would just crash immediately. And it was just that they had some system call had a subtle change, and that led to some crash bug. This is sort of the maintenance work where I think it would just be a death sentence to stop making changes to the software, because, well, we don't live on an island. We don't live isolated and can keep the whole world staying the same forever.
Greetings and salutations, my fellow plebs. My name is Walker, and this is the Bitcoin Podcast. The Bitcoin time chain is 860187, and the value of one Bitcoin is still one Bitcoin. Today's episode is Bitcoin Talk, where I talk with my guest about Bitcoin and whatever else comes up. And today, that guest is Murch. Murch is a computer scientist, engineer at Chaincode Labs, co-host of Bitdevs and the Chaincode Podcast, and moderator of Bitcoin Stack Exchange, answering literally thousands of questions about Bitcoin over the years. So he is the perfect person to talk to about what's happening with Bitcoin development and why it does or doesn't matter for you. Murch and I cover a ton of different topics ranging from the Bitcoin development process, the difference between changing Bitcoin versus maintaining Bitcoin, talk about ossification and what the hell that actually means, privacy trade-offs, address reuse, and potential improvements like silent payments. We also dig into quantum resistance, Bitcoin tail emissions, ZK rollups, covenants, and layer 2 scalability solutions like Lightning, ecash, fedimint, etc., plus their trade-offs. Murch also reviews the upcoming Bitcoin Core 28 release and what it means for you. Murch is an extremely knowledgeable dude, and while this conversation does get a little bit technical at times, I tried to pause and ask for clarification or definitions as much as possible so you can make sure that you understand what we're talking about even if you're not a super technical person yourself. This conversation should be a great introduction for anybody who wants to better understand how Bitcoin protocol development actually works, so I think you're going to love it. Before we dive in, do me a favor and subscribe to the Bitcoin Podcast wherever you are listening or watching, and check out my sponsor Bitbox in the show notes, or just go directly to bitbox.swiss/Walker and use the promo code Walker to get yourself 5% off the fully open source Bitcoin only Bitbox02 hardware wallet or anything else in their store. You can also grab links to protect yourself from SIM-swap attacks using Efani and Cloaked Wireless. I am a one-man show, so when you use my partner links, it genuinely helps me keep this show running, and I really appreciate it. If you'd rather watch this show than listen, head to the show notes for links to watch on YouTube, Rumble, and on Nostr via Highlighter and Flare.pub. But if you're like me and you prefer to just listen to your podcasts, I highly recommend you check out Fountain.fm. Not only can you send Bitcoin to your favorite podcasters to give value for value, but you can earn Bitcoin just for listening to this fucking podcast. Finally, if you are a Bitcoin-only company interested in sponsoring another fucking Bitcoin podcast, hit me up on social media or through the website bitcoinpodcast.net, or shoot me an email. It's hello@bitcoinpodcast.net. Without further ado, let's get into this Bitcoin talk with Murch. Murch, welcome. Thanks for coming on another fucking Bitcoin podcast. It's a treat to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
You know, we got talking in Nashville over some drinks, and this came to be. Was the first time we met, was it TabConf, like 2022? Does that sound right?
That would sound right insofar that I've been at a lot of TabConfs lately. I think I haven't missed one in a few years.
Okay, and that's we haven't been able to go the last 2 years, so it must have been 2022. I liked that conference a lot. Like smaller group, incredibly high signal. A lot of things that went over my head from a technical level, but I felt like I was getting smarter during it, so it was enjoyable.
Yeah, I love it's a sort of a sweet spot. So about 400 people, I think, is usually the crowd, and it means that you have enough people there to get good conversations going. But a lot of devs, a bunch of power users, maybe people that are invested in the space. It's also coming up soon. It's end of October, I think. I'm going to talk about cluster mempool there, and will contribute to the Socratic Village. So
Nice.
come on out, people.
Yeah. For anyone listening, if you haven't been to TabConf, and you don't have to be a developer to go, it certainly is a developer-focused conference, which is really good. But you can certainly go there as a non-dev and learn a heck of a lot and have a very good time. There's karaoke to be found, chess tournaments, all manner of shenanigans to get into. It was a well-run show.
So some of the participants in the karaoke really surprised me, like coming up with their own lyrics, surprisingly good singing voices. Yeah.
Bitcoiners are full of surprises. I found out. I've also found out Bitcoiners like karaoke a lot. Like when we were in Nashville, I somehow didn't plan on it, but was just jumped in an Uber and ended up at a karaoke bar called Santa's. Before you know it, I wasn't singing. I leave the singing to Carla. But yeah, Bitcoiners apparently congregate around karaoke watering holes, which is nice. There's probably some sort of insight to draw there. I don't know what it is though.
Maybe. I certainly heard that a lot of people went to Nashville. Must have been a hoot.
It was a tiny little bar too, so that makes it even better because you're just packed in there. It was also cash only, which is I like in a bar. It would have been nice if it was like cash and Bitcoin, but maybe next time.
Someday.
We'll see. Yeah. Well, Murch, I'm glad to have you on here because, again, we got talking in Nashville and just I was picking your brain about Bitcoin development and just we went a lot of different ways. Some of it got a little foggy towards the end because I did have a lot of beers. So what a perfect way to rekindle that conversation. But I want to start out just for folks who may not be familiar with you and what you do. Can you just say who you are? How did you get here today to be doing the quite wide variety and depth of things that you're doing?
Right. Yeah, I've been around the block once or twice. I got interested in Bitcoin over 10 years ago and have been contributing especially to Bitcoin Stack Exchange early on. It was sort of the first source of information that I found and really stuck with me. And so I work at Chaincode Labs in New York City today. We're a research and development center that contributes to Bitcoin. And I co-host Bitdevs New York, and we record an Optech recap from the Bitcoin Optech newsletter every week, mostly. I think we're at like 90 episodes in now. And so I do a bunch of education through, for example, I proofread Mastering Bitcoin 3rd edition last year. I have been a moderator on Stack Exchange for 10 years, have written about 2,000 posts there. And I think been working full time on Bitcoin companies or open source projects for 7 years now. Open source for almost 4 years now. Before that, I was at BitGo for a few years. I have a keen interest in wallet and coin selection, and through Stack Exchange, especially, I'm exposed to all sorts of topic around the technicalities of Bitcoin. So I think I'm pretty well broadly versed on how Bitcoin works under the hood.
Yeah, and I think first of all, that's an incredible amount of basically pieces of education doled out on Stack Exchange. That's that's a lot. And I know you're if folks have been on Bitcoin Stack Exchange, they're probably familiar with you, which is great.
I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so. But But I think that's so fantastic. That's why I've liked being able to pick your brain. Luckily, in person a few times too. Now we're separated by these damn screens, but they can't keep us apart forever. But I wanted a chance to talk to you today because I think for folks who are maybe either one have not been around Bitcoin for a while, maybe they got in like myself. I didn't buy Bitcoin until 2020. I'd heard about it much to my despair, several times before that, going back a number of years, but thought it was, magic internet nerd money and ignored it, as I think most people do. And so I got
Same
what
story,
I deserved.
a little earlier.
Right. Yeah. A little bit earlier, but I think that's the case for a lot of people, right? It's a very rare thing that somebody, the first time they hear about Bitcoin, they dive in head first. And to those people, I say, wow, kudos to you. Like that's incredible that you got it. That was not me. That's not most people. So if you're not that person, don't feel bad. But for those people that are non-technical, I think that Bitcoin and Bitcoin development can seem like sort of this, like, this Faraday bag that like nothing is getting in, nothing is getting out. They don't really understand. And a lot of times maybe they won't admit it. They're too scared to ask questions because they don't want to seem stupid. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. Luckily, I am fully okay with feeling or seeming stupid and asking stupid questions if it helps other people to understand things. And I think you're a great person to ask these questions too, because you've answered probably all of them, probably many times before, or referenced back to previous answers.
Yeah, thanks.
But yeah, no, and so I've got a number of things I want to get into with you today, and I know you had wanted to dive into also some of the Bitcoin Core 28 release stuff, which I would love to get into as well.
If it's of interest, I mean, we'll have to see where we get in this conversation, but yeah, it's coming up. It's on our mind.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to get into that. I think a good place to start for people though is maybe I think that there's some let's talk about Bitcoin base layer right now, layer 1 Bitcoin. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Bitcoin Core maintainers. There, various conspiracy theories floated around, things like that. Can you talk about that a little bit? Maybe just actually walk people through, like, how do changes happen in Bitcoin at a very high level? Okay, because people are worried about don't change Bitcoin, but there's also a difference between, quote, changing Bitcoin and maintaining Bitcoin, and I think that that's a really important distinction to make. Can you talk about that at kind of a high level, just to give people a picture of what does this actually look like in terms what's going on behind the scenes?
Right. Yeah, I think I would even distinguish it further. So there's changing the Bitcoin protocol. There's making changes to Bitcoin implementations. There's maintenance work. There's a lot of changes that are just changing how things work under the hood without changing the behavior. For example, in the upcoming 29 release, not the one that comes out now, but the one after, we just merged a new build system. Nobody will ever notice unless they compile Bitcoin Core from the source code, but it will hopefully make it a lot more future-proof to link up with different operating systems and build systems. And so, yeah, I think the one that people are mostly worried about are protocol changes. Bitcoin protocol development is notoriously slow. There is a lot of people that are sort of in a Mexican standoff with each other there. I think it's always the kernel of any such change is a small committed crowd, just some people that want to see a change in the world and are making it happen. But what is maybe more unique to Bitcoin is that none such change will get adopted against the adversity of the network. So if someone wants to change Bitcoin in a way that is detrimental to even a minority of the Bitcoin users, they're probably going to be unsuccessful because there's going to be vehement pushback. So I think every change starts with an idea. Often that those ideas are discussed on mailing lists or in-person meetings, conferences. Someone just talks to you and you're like, hey, wait, this would be brilliant or whatever. And I think one of the critical steps then is that there is some sort of attainable goal, something that we can do so much better with this protocol change to really bubble up this idea to a broad audience, to get a lot of buy-in across the ecosystem so that people feel that we've achieved something that we call rough consensus. So rough consensus is a term that is lent from Internet Protocol development. The IETF has an RFC that defines how to achieve rough consensus in a working group. They have the huge advantage that these working groups actually meet in person. They hum, and the chair will decide whether or not all of the open concerns have been sufficiently addressed, not necessarily resolved, but addressed, and whether there seems to be a rough consensus to go forward in that way. We picked the hard way of doing this by not all meeting in person. It's really hard to get the entire Bitcoin community into a room. And so one of the big open questions is, how do you even determine whether something has rough consensus? And I guess the old adage goes, I know it when I see it, but so basically you have to have an idea. You have to have a group of people, preferably, that really wants to work on this idea, over-engineer it, really test out what the implications are, what the second-order effects are, advocate for it, maybe also advertise it to the Bitcoin community in a way that the Bitcoin community says we absolutely should do this. And then probably after some time, you would achieve a protocol update. The other ones are easier, like changing an implementation. Well, we do that all the time when, I don't know, we fix a small off by one error, or we say, hey, this would be so much easier if this worked slightly different. This function call should use the new feature of the programming language that just came out. Maybe to put that in context, so software doesn't really break. If you had a piece of perfect software, it would continue to work forever if it were kept in the same environment. The problem is in computers that the entire environment keeps changing around the software that has been written. So when a new chipset comes out, there'll be new drivers for the chipset. Operating systems get new features. They might eventually deprecate some old interfaces, create new interfaces, and so forth. So a lot of the maintenance work is, for example, just keeping up with the environment changes around the piece of software and making sure that it continues to work. A couple of Bitcoin Core releases ago, for example, we had there was a change in Mac OS, and the new version of Mac OS couldn't start Bitcoin Core anymore. It would just crash immediately. And it was just that they had some system call had a subtle change, and that led to some crash bug. So that was discovered during the release process, and it was fixed before or right after release, before like really the version was adopted. But it's this is sort of the maintenance work where I think it would just be a death sentence to stop making changes to the software, because, well, we don't live on an island, we don't live isolated and can keep the whole world staying the same forever.
I think that that's a really great way of framing it, in terms of, even if the software is absolutely perfect, theoretically perfect, the environment still changes, and you don't have control over that environment and all the externalities that it presents. Thus, some changes are going to be required in order to keep things functioning for the vast majority of users. That would not be good if Mac OS users were unable to run Core, right?
Exactly.
And so I think that, and I think that some people, especially if they're not familiar with software development, haven't even worked tangentially with a software company, they think, changing Bitcoin, like, oh, well, why don't you just stop fiddling with it? It's fine the way it is. They're missing the context of, when we talk about, need to separate, quote, changing Bitcoin. Like, we're not talking about hard forks here. We're not talking about soft forks even. We're just talking about maintaining the code so that it is as widely usable as possible without things breaking for users, which then people say, when something does break, that's when people get angry. It's like, well, why didn't you see this coming? It's like, well, you told us just to leave it alone. So I thank you for that context, because again, I want to make that very clear for people that we need to separate the conversation of, quote, changing Bitcoin with maintaining Bitcoin. Those are two different things and serve different purposes. And just kind of on top of that, this idea of ossification is talked about a lot. And tell me what you think of this, but it seems to me that ossification is less of a discrete destination point. It is more of a journey, a process that sort of happens naturally. Like it's not like people decide, okay, everyone, today we'll ossify. It's just that it sort of happens, right? I mean, am I missing something there? Is there more nuance that you can provide?
I think, well, there's on the one hand that some people have different understandings of what the term ossification actually means. There's the people that say, just stop fiddling with the software altogether, and they call that ossification. There's people that use it as a way of stepping on the brake regarding protocol changes. They're concerned that their use cases may not continue to work in the future. I think we could probably be a little faster or a little slower in protocol development, and things would continue. I don't think that we want to stop completely. People project that a lot more users are going to be interested in Bitcoin in the future. And if they want that future to happen, I don't think that what we have right now is going to be able to facilitate that sort of adoption. And on the one hand, so for example, we got a new set of shareholders in this process with the ETFs. I think they might be related to the Sailor camp, where they may be most interested in the number go up use case of Bitcoin. And we just have a bunch of people. A lot of people are interested in multiple different aspects of Bitcoin, and there's many of them. There's the digital cash aspect, the ability to send payments all around the globe. There's the number go up savings technology. There's a privacy technology, of course. And so many are interested in multiple of these, but to varying degrees. And with the ETFs now, we have yet another part of the community that has different interests, potentially, eventually, a lot of money to throw behind some ideas or development. By the way, I think it would be absolutely brilliant if they would hire some Bitcoin developers that work on Bitcoin, hopefully with some sort of self-directed direction. But if they make money off of Bitcoin, they should also hopefully contribute to Bitcoin development down the road. But hopefully they don't dominate Bitcoin development, because no one use case should dominate Bitcoin development. It's sort of, well, we have to find something that works for most or all, hopefully. And what was your question again?
Well, no. Just around that ossification as a process, a journey, or right. Just this discrete destination, or I should say, maybe instead of a destination, a conscious choice at a moment in time. Well, go ahead on that, and then I have a couple follow-ups for you just on what you just said as well.
I think that ossification will happen naturally by the ecosystem becoming more complex and getting more participants that have partially contrary interests. And I would dare interpret ossification as just it getting harder to make changes, to evolve the ecosystem, because people are more invested in things working as they are already. Every system sort of prevents changes to itself. The stronger the system, the harder it becomes to change. I don't think that we actually want to go and say, okay, that's it. We have everything we'll ever need. Because that just seems a little naive to me. Who knows what the world will look like in 50 years or 100 years? I sincerely doubt that a Bitcoin protocol that was invented in the early 2000s would be the system of choice in 2100. And as well, I became a BIP editor in April, and so I've been going a lot through the BIP repository, which is the Bitcoin improvement proposals that deal with mostly ideas around protocol changes or protocols or standards for when two pieces of software interact. So, for example, that you can use backups from one wallet in another wallet. That's a good use case for a BIP. And if you look, for example, at the BIP process from, I think it's 8 years old, so 2016, obviously people that then contributed to this document were extremely concerned with soft forks and hard forks, because that was the topic. Everybody talked about, oh, should we do a block size increase? How should we do a block size increase? Should we do this? Should we do that? All sorts of soft forks proposals floated around, forward blocks, weak blocks, whatever. And the whole BIP process document is sort of cast in that light. And even just 8 years later, this is not our main concern. Soft forks are coming up as a topic right now, again, a little bit, but for many years in between, that was certainly not the thing that was most on our mind. It was the maybe the fight between about governance between users, developers, and miners, who sort of has a leading role, or how do they contribute to governance. Maybe in the last couple of years, privacy has been more of a topic where people had concerns. So all of these things, the software, the processes, they have to adapt to the challenges of the day. So if we just stop developing it, I think it'll just age away and not be interesting to people anymore. So we have to keep abreast of what's going on in the world around us and adapt to it.
So a couple things just on, and I appreciate the explanation, a couple things on your previous points. Regarding, so, everything has trade-offs, right? If we want to, like privacy, for example, there's a lot of trade-offs that we as individuals make every day. We trade our privacy for convenience quite often. Some of us are conscious of it, some of us are not. I think also with Bitcoin, at least the way that I see it is, Bitcoin was fundamentally pseudonymous or anonymous. You can debate which one in terms of how it is actually built. The privacy concerns that exist today are really a function of the on-ramps to Bitcoin. Like nobody was getting KYC'd when there weren't exchanges for Bitcoin. Nobody was getting KYC'd when exchanges weren't KYCing people for Bitcoin. There was no real world, quote, identity tied to your UTXO set before KYC came into effect. So that's an externality. Again, if we want to talk about the changing world around us, that's not a technical externality per se, but a legal or social externality.
Right.
So that's something where it's like you're not going to solve for KYC at the or maybe you can, but should you solve for KYC issues at the Bitcoin base layer, or can some of those privacy concerns be better addressed with solutions that are on layer 2s or 3s or however many layers you want to go? Lightning is better for privacy in that regard, just because it's a bit of a slush fund. Liquid even, LBTC goes into that federation, and it's like, unless the federation is required to hand that over, it's kind of a black box. Fedi is incredibly private within that federation. Not even the guardians have the ability to go in there and see who's doing what. So you have the ability to increase your privacy, move along that scale on these other layers. And you can do that as well. Like if you're earning Bitcoin, for example, and getting paid to a wallet that you just spun up that nobody knows about, and you are a NIM online and you got paid for doing some design work, let's say, there is no way anybody can know who that is attached to. I mean, without some intense forensic digging. But if you're a NIM online and getting paid to a fresh wallet, one can fairly safely assume that you're using a VPN, you're doing other things that would also mask any potential inroads to your personal real world life. So my point here being that I think that a lot of these conversations around we need to increase, Bitcoin base layer privacy, it's trying to hit a moving target because there are so many of these externalities from the legal world.
Right.
First, I'll just pause there to fair or unfair assessment.
I think it's a constant fight. Maybe I assume you, like I remember in the early 2000s when we would wait an hour to download an MP3 or whatever. And today everybody is streaming gigabytes of movies over the internet. I think that Bitcoin is growing in a similar way in that it keeps being a moving target. We keep shooting for a higher goal because we've solved other issues. Privacy, I think, is one of those things that are very hard to fundamentally improve because a lot of people, well, as you said, it usually contradicts convenience, and people care varying amounts about privacy. So, for example, address reuse is still incredibly rampant on the network, even though it's known to be one of the biggest privacy issues. It's such an easy thing to fix too. So absolutely fair.
For anyone listening who's like, what does address reuse mean, and am I doing it right now? Can you just give the TLDR on that so folks who are listening can say, oh, great, I don't need to do this again. I was doing that before.
Right. So Bitcoin addresses are reusable indefinitely. Addresses don't exist at the protocol layer either. It's really a shorthand for an output script that locks up your coins when you receive them, and you can reuse them. However, when you do, those outputs are very clearly controlled by the same entity because the same key, usually if it's a single sig setup, the same key can spend them. So by reusing the same address, you're heavily hinting at funds being owned by the same entity. And there's some users, especially exchanges, tend to give one deposit address per user, and then users that don't explicitly search for getting new deposit addresses each time, they just keep seeing that same deposit address and paying to it. Or even in private wallets, some people just are like, oh, this is my address, and there are slight benefits to that. Like, you'll see the address and you're like, oh yeah, this is my address, so it's easy for you to check whether you gave out the right thing. It's terrible for privacy, and not only your own privacy, also the privacy of any counterparty, because anyone that sends to you knows that all of these other payments have also gone to you. And even if they don't know who the sender was in the respective transaction, they know just to ask you for that information because you'll very likely be able to tell them. And it has a clustering effect on chain analytics. And so the easy fix is to just use them more as an invoice identifier rather than an address. It's a little unfortunate that the term address became the moniker for these payment identifiers. And the best practice would be to use a new address or to generate a new payment identifier for each payment, giving it out, using it only a single time. And that way, at least all of your funds are held in separate UTXOs. And if you don't spend them exactly together in a transaction, you're not hinting at them being owned by the same entity. And even if you're spending them in the same transaction, it could be a transaction created by multiple users together. So there's a little bit of wiggle room. However, if you're spending from the same script multiple times, there's very little wiggle room.
Well, right. And that's the thing that wallets, I'm sure it was maybe more manual back in the day, but since I've been around, wallets make this very easy to do. Like you can just, okay, a lot of them will have a list of like, okay, here's, they'll generate however many addresses for you. Okay, just use a different one for each time. Like it's something that folks should absolutely do. Because it is not difficult. You do not need to be technical to do it. I promise whatever wallet you're using has this built into their UI. It is a simple thing. So just wanted to point that out for folks because I think this is a really practical and easy way to at least make it slightly more private. Again, moving along that spectrum.
There's one thing that I'm very excited about in this context. So there's been a lot of work on silent payments recently. And the idea here is that you do have actually for the first time a Bitcoin address, in the sense that you have a silent payments address. And when people use that to send you a payment, under the hood, it always uses a new Bitcoin address, but it derives that from the silent payment address in a reusable fashion. So you can post that on your Twitter profile or in your podcast description. And every time people pay to you, it still looks like a completely distinct UTXO.
That's actually incredibly slick. And again, like that's just a better user experience, right? It's more private by default without the user needing to do any extra effort.
Right, exactly.
And so one of the other things I wanted to bring up, and then we can jump off to some other topics, but around like, you know, the sailor camp, let's say, that, you know, you mentioned earlier about you know, don't mess with this. And I think on the one hand, let me say it this way. I think that Sailor understands perfectly well what ossification in software means, and that because he has run a software company for 30 some years. I think he understands it very well. I think he is very good at distilling things down to simple terms that non-technical folks can understand. And I believe that's what he's doing here. Like maybe I'll don't think I can.
Yeah, I'm not trying to put words in mouths or anything, but just as an example for who I would associate with the number go up technology.
And it is a fair example. If I had to guess, and I'd love to ask him this, I would guess that if you said, when you say that Bitcoin shouldn't change, you know, what are you talking about specifically? Are we talking about not increasing the block size, not implementing tail emissions? Those I would guess probably be his two big things to maintain scarcity. But I'm guessing that if you asked him, do you believe that Bitcoin should still be maintained on an ongoing basis? He would say, yes, of course, because it's software, it needs to be maintained. Right. You know, so I think, but so just
hopefully.
Wanted to, hopefully, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm, you know, this is me assuming. I can make an ass of you and me here, but this is just my assumption. But so, you know, another thing I wanted to kind of, I guess, dig into is, you know, this idea that Bitcoin doesn't have like a roadmap in the same sense that, for example, Ethereum does, where they've got the merge and the purge and the splurge and the scourge and whatever other urge words that they have. I don't know if they have, maybe there is an urge just by itself too. I'm not sure. Vitalik's urge. But I think that that's kind of maybe confusing for people. It's like, well, what happens next? And, you know, maybe this is a good time to kind of talk about what's happening next for Bitcoin specifically in this next release, and just kind of dig into that, because I think a lot of people, again, if they're non-technical, they're newer and they're still just kind of going down this rabbit hole, figuring out how stuff works, they may not really know like what changes are happening, what changes are going to happen on that kind of the short term, and then what does that actually mean for them? Like how does that improve their experience with Bitcoin? Right. Can we talk? I think now's maybe a perfect time to dig into 28 a little bit.
Sure. Maybe let me answer your first gist, which was how do changes happen? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So Bitcoin Core, for example, as one implementation of the Bitcoin protocol, does not have a hierarchy, right? There's no team lead. There's no benevolent dictator for life. There's not even working groups or anything where you might have a working group leader or a project manager or anything. It's a loosely associated group of people that happen to care to work on Bitcoin Core. And a few of those people have the title of maintainer, which means that they have write access to the repository. What they do is they assess whether something has had sufficient review and is supported by the contributors. And once this is achieved, they will merge it. They don't decide what goes into Bitcoin Core. They don't set goals for the next release cycle. They don't hawk features or anything like that. They're basically janitors. They look, oh, is this ready to go? Let me rubber stamp it and wrap the box, and here it is. And sure, they also do a lot of review. They tend to be people that have been around the project for a long time, that are trusted. They do have some responsibilities, like facilitating the release process. But they're people that facilitate the process rather than lead or decide the content of the process. So what is in Bitcoin Core, we don't know what is going to be in the next release yet. We'll find that out in the next release cycle as people work on the things that they're scratching their own itches. They're working on the things that they deem important or interesting. And whatever is done by the feature freeze is in the next release. And then we do a release cycle, we branch off, we fix a few bugs, whatever we discover during the release process. So that's the release candidates. And once the release candidate has no known issues, it gets tagged and shipped. That's how a release gets together. So it's really just someone decided to work on something, found a few people that felt that it was important enough to review and contribute to, and they got it done before the release. And that's in the Bitcoin Core release. So if you want a feature in Bitcoin Core, be the change you want to see in the world.
I love it. I think people too, it's like they view, even folks within Bitcoin sometimes adopt the trope of like the Elizabeth Warren types who call, Bitcoin developers like shadowy super coders, and it's like, but really there's nothing shadowy at all. Like,
we're working in freaking public.
Yeah. As public as you could get. Like, compare that to how the Federal Reserve of the United States makes decisions behind closed doors and lets you know like a month later what their meeting notes were, redacted. We can be sure. But like, it is all in public. Like, there's nothing shadowy about it.
You can come to our repository, read every single issue, every single pull request which is the proposals at what to change in the code base. You can read the review comments. You can come to our IRC meetings on Thursday, 10 a.m. New York time. You can read the mailing list, Delving Bitcoin. I mean, you can't come to our office every day and listen to what we talk about during the day, but I mean, most of our collaborators live on the internet, so we eventually put the stuff out there for them to read, and then you can read it too, because it's not in a secret channel or anything. It's right in our public IRC channel in our code base, repository. So yeah, we're working in public. That itself is a strange experience at times, because really, if someone cares enough, they can just go and look what you did the last year and have opinions on that.
The great thing about Bitcoin is it doesn't matter if you're a highly technical developer or a tech illiterate boomer. You can still keep your Bitcoin safe for the long haul when you have an easy-to-use hardware wallet, like the Bitbox 02. Go to bitbox.swiss/walker and use the promo code WALKER for 5% off the fully open source, Bitcoin-only Bitbox 02 hardware wallet. Then get your Bitcoin off the exchange and into your own self-custody. The Bitbox team is honestly awesome. I'm super proud to be working with them and to have them as a longtime sponsor. And they build easy-to-use, secure, open-source solutions to keep your Bitcoin safe. Not only is the Bitcoin in your Bitbox safe from, say, government confiscation, but Bitbox is one of the only 2 wallets to actually address the dark Skippy vulnerability as well. So you're in luck if you have one. And if you don't, you can pick one up. I just had Staticus from Bitbox on this show recently, so check out that episode if you want to learn more about Bitbox and take a deep dive into self-custody best practices. Plus, and I cannot emphasize this part enough, the Bitbox 02 is truly easy as hell to use, and that's whether you are brand new to Bitcoin and it's your very first time setting up a hardware wallet, or you are a well-seasoned psychopath. It is Bitcoin only. And again, it is fully open source. You can head to their GitHub and verify that for yourself. There's no need to trust me or to trust Bitbox. When you go to bitbox.swiss/walker and use the promo code WALKER, not only do you get 5% off, but you also help support this fucking podcast. So thank you. Good or bad opinions, I'm sure. But I appreciate that primer for people because, again, for non-technical folks, the technical folks already understand this. And for any technical folks listening who are like, get on with it already, I'm sorry. But I think that this is not something that the more technical people need to understand. They already get how this works. But for people who are putting more and more of their wealth, their time, and their energy saving in Bitcoin, I think it's really important for them to understand this is all being done in the public. It's also being done by people who really, really care about this. And that's such an important thing. Like this, these people aren't hired. There's some grants and things that go around, right? And, hopefully more of those types of grants so that people can still do this development work without strings attached. But they're doing it because they really care about Bitcoin. And that's a beautiful thing to me.
It's just an interesting thing to work on for many of us. Yep.
Yeah. Well, so let's dive into the release 28 a little bit, just to give people an idea of what's coming here, because I'm guessing that many folks, myself included, don't know.
Right. I think one thing that people have maybe heard a little bit about was that testnet 3, which has been around for almost a decade, has had these block storms where blocks would move extremely quickly because people were fiddling with the difficulty. So there's going to be support for a new testnet in this release. Testnet 4 is launched in April. There's already a few faucets and so forth. And most notably, the issue that caused the block storms is fixed in this release. And so in this release, it only has support for testnet 4, but the default is still testnet 3. But probably most people that have infrastructure on testnet will want to look at testnet 4. And so, for example, industry, business-to-business companies, they often have test wallets on testnet where you can get some test coins and test your integration before you use it on mainnet. So testnet 4 is coming out with this release. There is an initial assume UTXO release in this one. So there will be a commitment to the block height 840,000, or rather the UTXO set at block 840,000, which was the halving in April, of course. And so if you download Bitcoin Core, you can also download this UTXO set snapshot and then use assume UTXO to just sync up from April to the current chain tip, and then in the background sync the rest and catch up to April this year again. And then it puts it all together. So you still sync the whole history, but you do a jump start. And the nice thing is, of course, we have a cryptographic commitment in the release. So if you verify that you built the release from the source code, or get it through a package manager on your operating system or some other way that you can trust that you're running a legit version of Bitcoin Core, you'll be able to have a functioning wallet much quicker, but still get the full validation eventually after a couple of days, maybe, depending on the speed of a few hours to a few days, depending on your hardware. Yeah, so far so good. More
so
questions
far, so
or comments?
good.
Okay, cool.
No. Keep on rolling.
There's a couple things that concern the mempool. Mempool, of course, is the waiting room for unconfirmed transactions. We generally propagate transactions on best effort. Like there's no guarantee that you'll see every unconfirmed transaction, but on best effort basis, we forward everything. And now, so far, we have not been able to do package relay in the sense that we can't send a set of transactions that belong together as a group. We could only propagate transactions in single transactions by themselves. And that led to some issues. For example, last week, or maybe a couple of weeks ago by now, Babylon had the staking on chain, and suddenly for 6 blocks or so, fee rates went to 1,000 sats per VByte. And then this week they had the unbonding for the 400 or so Bitcoin that overpaid their target of 1,000 Bitcoin stake. And these were forced to be at 200 sats per VByte, these transactions. And then the mempool, or the block minimum fee rate went to 200. So at these points, we saw some issues where Lightning nodes would talk to each other and be like, hey, I would like to increase the fee rate of the commitment transaction, our channel state on the Lightning network. And the other node goes like, are you crazy? That's really high. I'll close the channel. And so there's a bit of a consensus mechanism between two Lightning channel partners. They have to agree on the commitment transaction. And if they disagree, usually they just choose to broadcast the old version. So a bunch of Lightning channels closed due to disagreements between Lightning nodes of different implementations or just different fee estimations, because they couldn't agree on what an appropriate fee rate would be for the commitment transaction. Okay, that's hopefully going to get fixed with one of the new features that are shipping in 28 down the road once it's adopted more across the network. So in 28, it will be possible to opportunistically propagate one parent, one child packages. So packages of two transactions where you have a low fee rate parent and a high fee rate child, which uses the child pays for parent mechanism. So miners want to include the juicy child, but it is only valid after the parent creates the output that is spent by the child. So they're forced to include the parent before the child to get the fee of the child, right? So what happened so far would be, for example, the Lightning channel was committed to a specific fee rate the last time the nodes agreed. And if that fee rate is now drastically below what fits in the mempool, because when too many transactions are added, submitted to the mempool, eventually we kick out the ones with the lowest fee rates. So you might not be able to broadcast your commitment transaction to the mempool. And then even when you try to bump it, the child is also invalid because the parent is missing. You can't spend an output that isn't there. And then both of those transactions would just not exist on the network and couldn't get included in a block. So what happens now is if we get the child first, we don't know what fee rate it has at all because we don't know the input. So we don't know how much money came in on the input side because that information lives in the parent transaction. So we put it in our orphanage, right? Child without parent. And
so sad.
Which is a data structure. And so when we now get a broadcast of the parent transaction, we evaluate it. Oh, the fee rate is too low. It doesn't fit in our mempool. And we used to just throw it away at that point because we don't want it. Now we go and check, hey, do we have a child in the orphanage that belongs with this parent? And we try the two as a group together. Now, if the child pays enough to get the parent into the mempool, they both go in together. And that is a non-robust but somewhat working way how we can get rid of this whole issue where channels close suddenly because the fees spike. Because if the commitment transaction is low, you can just attach a high fee rate child, a higher fee rate child than you would have otherwise, and the two will propagate on the network together. So hopefully we will not see all these unnecessary channel closures down the road, like when 28 is out and it's somewhat broadly adopted across the network, then the Lightning implementations have to change how they think about the channel closing process and so forth. So hopefully maybe a year or so, but this problem is going to go away.
So if you had channels close unexpectedly in like the last week or so, this was why?
Yes.
Oh, well, okay.
You might have heard about the channels closing, but yeah, that's the reason why.
I had some channels closing, so this explains things. Okay.
Yeah, hopefully that's just not going to be an issue in about a year.
Okay. Wow, that's for some reason this gave me the mental image of like a parent loses their kid at the supermarket, and the supermarket attendant like has the kid up at the front, and they're like, "Does anyone own this child?" That's for some reason that came into my head as the image there, but it's a child made of Bitcoin.
Right.
Yeah, I digress.
And the child is rich, the parent is poor.
Right. Yeah, the child is paying for the parent.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So yeah, this has been my colleague. Is that me? Oh, sorry.
We're good.
Just an alarm. Okay. So my colleague Gloria Zhao she's been working on package relay for a few years, and this is sort of one of the first parts that will actually change the user experience that's finally shipping. A lot of that is hopefully going to come in the next couple releases with cluster mempool, which fundamentally changes how we think about groups of transactions, unconfirmed groups of transactions. Hopefully not in a way that changes the user experience of people creating transaction much, but it'll make it way easier to do package relay with more transactions. And hopefully the outcomes will be more expected, and stupid issues like channels just randomly closing won't happen like that anymore.
So that's again, in terms of like, what does this mean for the average non-technical user? That's actually a very real thing. Like you
hopefully,
won't have
yes,
channels shutting down for no reason where you're trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Like this will just be something you don't have to worry about. Hopefully, again.
Well, it'll take some time. I don't want to overhype it. So this ships in 28, which is end of September. Then we need probably 10-20% of the nodes on the network to run this, so that the transactions somewhat reliably propagate, and then the Lightning implementations have to change how they negotiate commitment transactions. But I think they can unilaterally just not tell that they want to increase fee rates. So hopefully that'll be somewhat quick to adopt. But probably, I'm saying probably a year or so, sure, so as not to overpromise.
it's not going to happen the day after. Yeah. Got it.
So there's a closely related change called truck transactions. This was described as BIP 431, and this is basically a opt-in restriction on your transactions topology. It can either have one parent or have one child and not exceed a certain weight. But then in that case, the parent can have a fee of 0. And now with what we just discussed with the one parent, one child opportunistic package relay, we can actually have commitment transactions that pay 0 fees. So you will not need a channel reserve, for example, on your Lightning channel anymore. And even if your commitment transaction pays 0 fees, it'll be able to get into the mempool.
That's kind of wild then.
Yes.
Right? Like that so wait, maybe if we can dig into that one a little bit deeper.
Sure, of course.
So I'm opening a new channel, and I'm actually like I'm not needing to pay anything at the start. It's only like it's once that is, or like, yeah, can you break that break that down a little bit? So yeah.
When you have a channel right now, you do have to make a transaction at first to create the output, right? A Lightning channel on chain looks like a transaction output. It is just owned by 2 people together, both of the channel participants. And so far, most commonly, the channel is opened by one side. So they pay for the transaction and they negotiate with the other party, hey, give me something so I can get my money back in case this fails. And then they send money to this collaboratively owned UTXO, and all of the funds are on one side. And after that, the money in the channel can move back and forth. On-chain, nothing ever happens. All of that is just negotiating how this channel will get paid out eventually. And to guarantee that you will be able to pay for the unilateral channel closing, the commitment transaction, there's a channel reserve. So you actually do not get to use all of the money that you put in a channel, but there's like, I think it's 1% or 2% that is restricted from being used once the other side has gotten a little bit. You can't send all of your money. Every side needs to keep a little bit. And this is A, to be able to pay for the commitment transaction, and B, so if they cheat, that they always have to lose something, right? If they have a past state where, or if they get to a state where they own 0 of the channel, they wouldn't have a financial disincentive not to cheat, right? So with the commitment transaction, at least this first concern goes away, where you don't have to pay for the with truck transactions, TRUC, which stands for topologically restricted until confirmation. The parent transaction can have a fee rate of 0, so you can have a channel that has a 0 fee rate and pay fully with the child for the confirmation. So you bring your own fees to close the channel, which means you can decide when you want to close, how much fees you want to pay, and you don't have to have a reserve in the channel itself in order to be able to send the transaction. You still want probably the reserve actually, because you want to be able to punish the other side reliably for the people that like Ellen penalty. Maybe one day we'll get Ellen symmetry, but we can get into that on another podcast.
that sounds good. I appreciate you digging
that's
a little
up
bit
any
deeper.
prev out. Yeah.
So again, I think these are, maybe for folks who aren't running a Lightning node, this may sound a little bit Greek to them, but for folks that are, I think this is like very, again, like experience improving stuff. Is there anything else coming in the release that is of note?
Yeah, one last that belongs to this family, which is pay-to-anchor outputs become standard in Bitcoin Core 28. And there is an improvement of estimate smart fee. So the fee rate estimation in Bitcoin Core is extremely conservative, as is often espoused on Twitter. What you're actually saying is when you say, I want to target a 2-block target, I want to be in the next 2 blocks with a 95% reliability. So it tends to be extremely conservative. My recommendation is, if you're relying on Bitcoin Core's fee estimation, pick a higher block target. You probably don't need it in the next 2 blocks. Probably you're fine if you get it in the next hour. So go for 6 or maybe even 12 blocks. Those tend to not shoot up as brutally. And by default, Bitcoin Core will now run in economical mode instead of conservative mode. So that means that the likelihood of getting into that block is a little less. So, for example, if there's a very slow block, you might need to bump it in order to achieve your confirmation target. But given that RBF is getting a lot easier and more common, we think that an active observer can very easily bump, and someone that is not actively watching the transaction probably also doesn't need it that urgently, or hopefully. Oh, and I forgot one that is very important. So in Bitcoin Core 24.0.1, which is a release from 2 years ago, we shipped a new startup option called Mempool Full RBF. I'm sure you have heard about this one.
I was literally going to ask you about that next as part of this. Yeah, perfect.
Oh, cool. So we have observed now that about 95% of the hash rate is using Mempool Full RBF. And what that means is when RBF first got introduced about 8 years ago, we fashioned it as an opt-in flag. You declared a transaction to be replaceable, and only if the original transaction had declared replaceability would you accept replacements for it as a node. Like, it was sort of a gentleman's agreement where nodes would say, I have seen something else already that tries to spend the same UTXOs. I will not accept the replacement because it didn't say that it was allowed. And so for a very long time, people have been thinking that that is an unstable equilibrium, because if someone is offering a lot of fees to mine a replacement, miners should take the replacement in order to maximize their fee revenue. So there had been people asking for a startup flag that allows you to always accept replacements, even if the original had not signaled replaceability. So this was added to Bitcoin Core 24 and was turned off by default. But it looks like this year that almost all the hash rate has turned it on. They accept any transactions that replace other transactions. We see this especially in the context of ordinal marketplaces where they sort of have a PSBT-based bidding scheme where you can sort of have part of a transaction here's the thing that I'm offering. This is the amount of money that I want to get paid to my own address. And then the buyer can just fill in their input. Here's the money I'm bringing, and I send the thing that I bought to myself over here. And the mechanism with which these bids get exchanged is the buyer just fills out the rest of the transaction, broadcasts it, and then if other people see it, they can overbid it with RBF. So some people were like, oh, I'm going to totally send a transaction that's not replaceable, so my bid will be seen first and nobody else can overbid it. And miners notice that there's money to be collected. So I think this, to a large part, contributed towards RBF being not relying on this original replaceability. So in 28, it's turned on by default, and this also solves a UX issue, a big UX issue, where a lot of people, especially when fee rates were fluctuating brutally, see, for example, the entire last year, you would send a transaction, and if your wallet didn't mark the original as replaceable, you'd just be stuck. Either you have to make a second transaction, pay even more in order to CPFP it, which we discussed earlier, or you'd be stuck. You might have to pay out of band for some miner to include it, which usually is even more expensive than bidding on-chain. And so all transactions will be replaceable, so any wallet can replace it. You're not going to be stuck like that, where you're just staring at your transaction. It's sitting there, it's not confirming, it's also not falling out of the mempool or becoming invalid or anything. So I think that's like the big cornerstones of the next release. There's a few small things too, of course.
No, I love it because now anyone who's just listened to this is now up to date with this, and I appreciate the full RBF explanation too. I know because that was fairly hotly debated at the time for a while. I remember talking to John Carvalho about this in detail for a while. And John, if you're listening to this at some point, hello. But, and I thought he had some really excellent points about it. I know it obviously ended up going through. Now it's kind of one of those things with, I guess the rough consensus where it's just there now. In
a way, I'm a little unhappy with how it went because...
How so?
Being able to signal that you do not intend to replace a transaction provides more information than not being able to say that anymore, right? So we inherently have less information from the sender to the recipient here anymore, which I think goes a little towards what John liked about the flag, the opt-in flag. The other thing is we might get rid of a fingerprint because some software always creates replaceable transaction. A lot of software creates always transactions that are not replaceable. So this fingerprint will hopefully eventually go away and everybody can replace it. So in our way more dynamic mempool where fee rates suddenly spike a factor 300, people will remain flexible and be able to push their payment through, even if they didn't anticipate originally that they would have to expedite it.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate the explanation there because again, these are some of those things where I think people see these discussions on X or at that point Twitter, I think, and wonder like, I think there's always the question is like, do I need to care about this? And that's kind of where I want to get into next a little bit is, so first question is, what do you think are the hot debates within Bitcoin right now that people do not really need to care about or that aren't really consequential versus what are the ones that you think are very consequential, very important, that do need to be discussed more?
Ooh, I hope nobody will crucify me for my answers in a moment. So I think people concerned about quantum are a little caught too far in the future. I hope that we don't have to care about that for a couple decades at least. I think I sometimes have the impression we will never have to care about it, but we'll have to see about that one. It's good to have a BIP out that makes some proposals, and there was a NIST standard recently with quantum-resistant signatures. One concern is, of course, that all of that is immensely bigger, right? So where a transaction now would start at 65, well, a standard payment transaction can be slightly less than 100 VB, virtual bytes. And most of these quantum-resistant signatures are in the several kilobytes by itself. So for each signature, you'd have a few kilobytes. So that would drastically reduce the number of payments, the payment capacity of the network if we adopted that today. And even then, I think it would be hard to argue that it fixes the issue, because everybody has to move their funds into a quantum secure output in order for them not to be able to be stolen when a quantum computer reaches the capability to break ECGSA. So something like a third of all Bitcoin is in addresses that had been reused, or addresses that where the public key is generally available, like pay to public key or taproot outputs. And if quantum computers break ECGSA, all of those can be spent directly. Hopefully we don't have to care about that for at least a few decades. The other one that I think we have a little time on is people are concerned about the fees not being high enough. You mentioned tail emission a couple times already. So one proposal is, let's do away with the 21 million limit and create new coins on each block, because then we can guarantee that miners will always have revenue, even if the fees do not make up for it. And I think that's also a little premature. We don't have to worry today about the fees paying the miners, because the fees right now are in the single-digit % of the total revenue. Even when the fee rates explode, it's just a small part of the total block reward. We have a couple more halvings at least, if not maybe, I'd say 2 or 3 before it even becomes interesting, where I would expect fees to more often be on a similar range as the block subsidy. And if fees go up anyway, then we don't have to worry in the long run. If the fees do not reach the subsidy, then we should revisit. Maybe start burying some of the existing coins from the existing rewards to future rewards, or do at least fee smoothing where a miner can't take the entire block reward, but it has to be spread with the next few blocks. Or there's people talking about it, having good thoughts on it. Very clearly, we do not need it today, and we should do more research.
A quick note on that, because I find the tail emission discussion, like anybody raising this and very seriously saying we need to be thinking about tail emissions, I find it to be generally a bad faith argument, because first of all, it's presupposing that all of the conditions which exist today are going to be the same conditions which we operate at a time in the future, which we know, first of all, humans are terrible at predicting the future. Second of all, from past experience, we know that is not going to be the case. Even though we are bad at predicting the future, like we know it's probably not going to be what we think it looks like, and it's going to be something more extreme than that in one way or another. The other thing is, I always find that these the Bitcoin, it's like this oscillation between we need tail emissions because the fees won't be able to incentivize miners to secure the network enough, and then going back to the other side of the fees are too high, we need to do something to bring down fee, and it's like, and it's back and forth, this ping pong, and it's like maybe we don't need to do anything there because this is going to work itself out, and this is a free market for block space, and people have the right to pay as much as they want or as little as they want and not be included in the block, but that is going to work itself out. And I think I find that to be potential quantum vulnerabilities aside, when we talk about block size, because I know obviously one could probably make the argument that we should increase block size because the size of these signatures is going to need to be so much larger that you need to change the block size in order to account for the decreased amount of transactions that can be in there due to the increased size of the signatures, right? I find that to also be a similar kind of slightly, flawed argument where it's like, well, okay, but at that time that would be a fork, right? As it was previously, as it was when Bitcoin Cash was created.
Yeah, increasing the block size is a hard fork.
Yes. That's a hard fork. So, okay, in that event, then the free market will again decide which version of Bitcoin do I want. Do I want big block, allegedly more quantum resistant Bitcoin, or do I want same size block, still quantum resistant Bitcoin, but with a lot less transactions going through?
Right.
And so maybe it will fork at that point. Like that's a very real possibility that could happen.
Very likely in our past experience, every time there's a hard fork proposal, it did fork.
Yeah, right. But so I'm digressing into block size, but on the tail emission specifically, I think that when people say that we're going to need to increase or add tail emissions or whatever, or make some sort of changes to the distribution mechanism of Bitcoin, it's a failure to see the future that we're going toward. Like first of all, the required fees are going to increase in Bitcoin terms, which I would call real terms. They're also going to increase in nominal fiat terms. So when you're talking about your energy inputs going into that, maybe they'll all be priced in Bitcoin by the time this is a problem, who knows? But it's missing both sides of that. So it's missing the fact that these are going to keep increasing because usage is going to keep increasing. Even if a lot of that usage is offloaded to ETFs, let's say, for very large amounts, which I think it is right now, we're seeing that. Even so, I don't see usage decreasing. If that happens, then, boy, I think we have bigger problems.
So far, actually, fee rates denominated in Bitcoin have been surprisingly stable. Less so in the last year, but... So we didn't have the mempool clear completely since last April, which is now, I think 16 months should be the longest period of time that this has ever been the case. And before that, there was basically at least once per week, you could get transactions through at any fee rate, which was the minimum relay transaction fee rate of 1 sat per VByte. So right now, you can get transactions through at 3 sats per VByte. In terms of Bitcoin, sure, that's a 3x, but it's not that much of an increase. In terms of in terms of wealth or value, this is a higher value. But also the amount of purchasing power that's been flowing with each Bitcoin transaction has drastically increased in the last few years. So in relative terms, I think it's even cheaper to send money with Bitcoin than it used to be for the amount of money that is being transferred, or purchasing power or whatever. But
if we want to call fiat real money, that now it's a whole other sidebar.
Real money. I'd say money. Yes, real money. Yes. We can fight more on, but we don't have to solve that today. But yeah, I think given that the block space demand was so high in the last year and the mempool never cleared out completely in the last 16 months, I would not be surprised that it also pushes up as new use cases, new layer 2s compete for block space. If people come and do roll-ups where they want to write several megabytes of data in a short sequence of blocks in order to have their zero knowledge proof in there, that'll also create demand for block space. So one thing that I think maybe especially a lot of people that are doing DCA today and DCAing small amounts should keep in mind is every input that when you receive an output, you commit to a specific input type. So you'll always have to purchase a certain amount of block space. And generally, it's been true that block space doesn't get cheaper. So if you are sitting on a $5 UTXO from each day of the last year, first, may I suggest that you first aggregate a few of those purchases before you withdraw it into bigger chunks. But also, please consider currently the mempool is as cheap as it hasn't been for 16 months. So maybe consider consolidating into fewer pieces if you're sitting on thousands of tiny amount UTXOs. Just, I don't know if that's your audience, but
no, I think it is, because I was talking with Wicked Smart Bitcoin about this just a couple days ago, because he's
really?
always very he's pushing very hard, like, consolidate your UTXOs, and I think that there was there's been various companies that built out, like, first of all, automatic withdrawals to cold storage to a reused address. So flag 1 on the reused address. Second flag, automatic withdrawals of daily DCA, which is just creating a bunch of potentially dust UTXOs that you may not be able to spend in a high fee environment that is persistent.
Exactly.
And so, I don't like to tell anyone what to do with their money, but it behooves you to wait to withdraw your DCA until you have a decent sized output, like UTXO, that you're going to receive. Like, please, for the love of God, don't withdraw them. And if you're DCAing $5 a day, please, or more than that, like, unless you're DCAing a really fat chunk a day, like you are rolling in it, you really should not be withdrawing that every day. That is not going to
but if you're
well.
DCAing a fat chunk every day, probably you should also keep a little more with your exchange, because you can afford. You have a little more risk tolerance.
Yeah, well, that's a fair point as well. So either way, you should probably just wait until you build up a larger stack in your exchange. Don't keep it on there forever, but at least wait until you can make it a large-sized UTXO, which is going to cost you. Don't
keep your stack with your brokerage or exchange.
Yeah.
But let it accumulate a little bit so you can withdraw decent chunks, so you don't pay yourself silly.
Yeah.
Like, You'll just imagine fees never go below 10 sats per VByte or so, or 50. Who knows? You'll have tens of thousands of sats that just where 60-80% of the value goes towards buying the block space to spend it. So yeah, just run the numbers, look at it a little bit, and if you had an episode with Wicked Smart, then probably he had. Or I think he had all the details.
Yeah, but it's a really good practical thing that, like, I didn't fully understand until I was doing a collaborative multi-sig to raise some money for a charity in El Salvador, and all of a sudden we were like, wow, why are our fees so high when we're trying to transfer this out to the charity? And it was like, oh, because we've got a bunch of tiny UTXOs. And so, like, sometimes you don't understand these things until you actually run into the wall.
Right.
But luckily, there are a lot of people who've been like Wicked and yourself who shout about this very loudly. So please listen and please utilize low-fee environments to consolidate UTXOs. Send them to yourself to a new address, please. And also recognize that there are privacy trade-offs with that, of course, because you are basically putting all those UTXOs together into one new one.
You're heavily hinting that all of that money is controlled by one entity. Yes.
It would be a big
That's a fair shout out too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I maybe just to give a stat here, the UTXO set has increased from 80 million to 180 million in the last 1.5 years or so, and a lot of that is people trading in on-chain graffiti, but some of this is also DCA. So if you're in that boat, please think about the future block space that you have committed to buy.
Yeah, that's a very good piece of advice. So we digress slightly, but this is a show for digressions. But okay,
Wonderful.
So other things that you either are overblown, people are kind of distractions, or actually I guess underblown, not talked about enough. People should pay attention to. Where does ZK rollups fall in that? And maybe can you explain that at a high level, what that means for folks? We don't have to go deep.
I guess what you're basically trying to do is you prove that a payment has happened as it was intended outside of the blockchain, and you just write that proof to the chain. And so it's you can think of it as sort of a layer 2 or side chain mechanism. I don't think I can actually explain any of the ZK rollup things.
Okay.
One of the problems is, so this is a scaling mechanism that is popular on Ethereum. And in Ethereum, we have a different philosophy here. In Ethereum, all of the calculations happen on chain. When you have a smart contract, the smart contract is written out in the Ethereum transaction and executed by every single node that validates the blocks. In Bitcoin, we tend to work with a witness, and we already have essentially the mechanism that people use to build ZK proofs. We already just prove that it was done right. We don't tell you all of the details that had to happen. So for the most part, so for example, when I don't want to get too deep into mechanisms, but the philosophy of Bitcoin is essentially to just prove that it went right rather than sharing all the details of the contract that you made. When you have a music input, for example, it might under the hood be a 3 of 3 or a 20 of 20, but nobody will ever know because you just provided a valid signature that resolved for anyone to see that you were allowed to spend this. And how you achieved that under the hood, whether there was an oracle whose signature had to be tweaked in, whether there was a single signer or 15 signers, that's nobody's damn business, right? So with the ZK rollup, getting sort of this, I proved that I did it wrong, I proved that I did it right, hopefully.
Let's hope.
You get a scalability because you don't have to write all of the smart contract on chain. But in Bitcoin, we don't do that so much. So in Ethereum, it's a huge scaling effect. In Bitcoin, what I've seen, I think, is like a 2.5x or so maybe that we would be able to achieve versus just on-chain transactions. Maybe I'm not up to date to the latest proposals, but I think it is a slightly less powerful mechanism for us than for other blockchains.
Okay. I appreciate the context there. Other things that either you think people should pay attention to or things that are overblown?
Ordinals, who cares? I mean, just it's like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer on, what is that, a 20? Like, yes, this $20 bill might be valued more than $20 by whoever it has. They might put it into a frame on in their living room because it's really cool and all. And they take a bill out of circulation. Big whoop. Turns out that people have different things that excite them. For some people, this is what allows them to send funds to their family across the planet, or the only way that they can even pay for services because their country is sanctioned, or just a brilliant idea. For other people, they have a different approach. They want to have art. They buy block space. So we have a somewhat fair marketplace. We have exactly strict rules how transaction weight counts towards the block space limit, and they are paying to use this block space in a different way. It's not one that I really care much about, but also as long as they're paying for it, if you want to get a transaction through, pay a little more than them. They're paying less than 3 sats per vbyte for it right now. So if you can't pay 3 sats per vbyte, I don't know if your transaction was that important. I don't want to, like, if you have very little money, on-chain transactions are prohibitively expensive. But that is mostly because the cost for a transaction scales with the amount of block space that you buy, which scales in the number of inputs and outputs you create, and it doesn't scale with the amount of money you're sending. So I don't want to sound cruel or dismissive, but if you're trying to put coffee payments on the blockchain, it is natural that you will be priced out, because someone that is pushing $1 million into an ETF or out of an ETF they can pay more than you in absolute terms, because for them in relative terms, it'll be way less than your $5 coffee payment. And that's just how the framework of how Blockspace is priced, how this network works, how every single node on the network has to verify every piece of data that goes onto the blockchain, propagate it and validate it and store it if they want to keep an entire archive of the blockchain. So, I mean, none of this comes as a surprise. I believe I've written answers about this 9 years ago when Lightning first came up as an idea. Well, Lightning might be a valve for that, because small payments, naturally, on Lightning, they pay relative to the amount of money they're sending. On-chain, they pay for the block space they're using. So small payments are favorable on Lightning, or other layer 2s, really. And large payments win on-chain, and it's just the circle of life.
No, I don't find that to be in any way callous. I find that to be realistic, because that's the thing. It is supposed to be a free market for block space, and that should be a competitive market. And that competitive market for block space ultimately benefits everyone who uses Bitcoin on any layer, because it means that our base, our foundation is more sound, right? Now, this is also the whole point of layers on top of Bitcoin. You've got the other extreme, which is the Solana, which says we're going to do however many, 69 million I don't know how many transactions they do, but however many transactions, a second, we're going to scale it at the base chain. Well, but again, we talked about trade-offs earlier. Then you trade off. You're always going to have trade-offs with decentralization or security. Solana, I think, lost both of those, given how often their devs, have to actually do something to stop the chain. But I think
famously, they had multiple outages, some of them several days. That's not a live system.
No, that's a cute project, but that's not base layer money for the future of humanity.
They're solving a different problem. They're solving a smart contract resolution platform. And, well, we're not trying to put all the smart contracts on the blockchain. We're just trying to put the proofs that we resolved the smart contract correctly on the blockchain. And we will be able to have complex smart contracts, preferably out of band. Like, if we look at simplicity, miniscript, discrete log contracts, various layer 2 proposals, in a way, even fedimint, cashew, and all of those, they allow us to have very different trade-offs, more complex smart contracts, partially Oracle-based, or just in a Taproot script path that never has to hit the chain because all of the participants agreed that it would be valid to broadcast it, and just sign off on the key path, and you never see that there was complex conditions that could be enforced but didn't have to be enforced because they could be enforced. So I think we chose to do it the difficult way, but I think we might be able to go way further than alternative approaches. That's why one of the reasons I'm still excited about Bitcoin after, 12 years now, is I read it, when I finally read the white paper, I was like, this will actually work. And this is exciting because we don't have a cache on the internet. It looks like we can have smart contracts. We can build all sorts of really cool stuff here. And we don't have to show everyone what we agreed upon. And we can still use the blockchain as an unbiased judge of what actually was valid to broadcast and get those smart contracts resolved in the way they were written.
And I think I'd love to just ask a little bit, because you led me in perfectly, because I wanted to ask your thoughts just on ecash, like the cashew implementation, and then you have fedimint, which is also it's a federated ecash. You've got Fedi, which is obviously a company building on top of that, but is also committed now to their source viewable now, and will go fully open source soon. I don't know. I don't remember exactly when, but I think to me so ecash and federated ecash fedimint plus Lightning. Those are the solutions that people who are trying to pay for a coffee, like that whole trope of like, well, you should be able to pay for your coffee on the base chain. No, you shouldn't. If you can pay for your coffee on the base chain, well, that's probably not a very used base chain. Like that's okay. Go to Solana and pay for your coffee on the base chain, and nobody's gonna want your shitcoin. Sorry to be harsh to any Solanians out there or whatever you call yourselves, but like ecash and fedimint and Lightning, these solutions built on top of Bitcoin, they work. And of course, there's always going to be things that need to be ironed out, improvements that can be made, like in, fedimints, like, having auto sweeps, for example, to make sure, because the risk there is you could get rugged, right? Same with an ecash mint, non-federated ecash mint, you could get rugged. So do an auto sweep, have a bunch of different mints, like, but again, trade-offs. But for somebody who wants to buy a coffee or transact locally in their community or transact with near perfect privacy, these are the solutions. The base chain doesn't need to do everything. The base chain needs to be the most solid foundation we can possibly have, because without that, none of these other amazing things that we can build in layers on top of it matter at all. And I guess that wasn't really a question. That was just me starting to rant. But
I fully agree so far.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone claims there's no trade-offs, either they haven't thought deeply about it or they are lying to you. There's always trade-offs. And very specifically here, the fedimint is a federation, as it's named, and the cashew servers are custodial, as we know. So you have a very heavy trade-off here. You're trusting them with your money. Well, but it might be possible to trust them with the money you would carry around in your wallet, and you can make a bunch of payments from that never need to hit the base chain. You have perfect privacy against the mint, against the sender and recipient have I believe also perfect privacy to each other. So yeah, there is a bunch of trade-offs. It is really exciting how so Chaumian ecash came up in, I think it was late 90s, and then was famously tried as a company by David Chaum, DigiCash, and the problem was that it had a central point of failure. This company was first regulated and then I think shut down. Someone else go check the history exactly. But the main point was it didn't succeed because it was trying to have a central service that was adding a lot of privacy for a government money. And with Bitcoin as our base money, these mints can operate across country borders. Yes, you should probably keep in mind that it's custodial and they can run away with all of your money, but none of them can censor you because nobody knows. They can't distinguish their customers, at least if they properly implement it. So, yeah, super interesting trade-off. This is scaling tech that I'm excited about. Yes, you have custodial risk, but if it's for a small amount of money, that like an amount of money that you might spend in 2 days, it's probably not going to break your bank for most people. And the privacy trade-offs are cool. And you don't have to buy on-chain space, so it's super cheap, right? So if you're not excited about it, at least from a theoretical standpoint, you should appreciate the options and the trade-offs and like just the possibilities that we've gotten in the recent years. So the Lightning Network sort of acts as a lingua franca between the mints, and even if you go from one mint to the other, you never hit the chain. This would also hold for many of the other ideas that are proposed as layer 2s, where you can move in and out via Lightning. I know some people advocate that you could do your stacking on Liquid and then transfer out via Lightning instead of pegging out, which is faster and easier. So I think a lot of the potential that will lead to the Bitcoin network scaling in the long term comes in these currently undiscovered technologies and how they combine. Not just fedimint by itself is okay, Cashew by itself is okay. Either of those with the Lightning Network is way cooler.
It makes me very excited because, again, these are there's also so many things like what Fedi is doing with also building in Matrix chat within it, building in Nostr integrations for basically social proof if you need it within high trust local communities or decentralized communities that also want to build up some sort of a web of trust. Like having all of these things that you can these different layers, not just the monetary layers, but the decentralized social layer, the decentralized communication layer, all of these things, and having all of that be not observable by outsiders and not censorable by either outsiders or insiders is incredibly powerful, because then you actually have the full suite of tools that you need to be able to move a little bit further down that spectrum of sovereignty, and to be able to to really do whatever the fuck you want. So like there's no KYC in a fedimint, and that's beautiful. And then, but you're still ultimately able to settle that in the hardest money that has ever been discovered by humans, which is Bitcoin. And without that layer one, all the rest of it is meaningless. But we have that layer one.
And I mean, sovereignty being one thing, but also just the creeping surveillance state and surveillance capitalism. Like each of your credit card payment is shared with 180,000 companies. The EU is going to renegotiate chat filters again for the third time now or whatever under the third commission country chairing the commission. Basically, this is when people think about what corners of the philosophy and world the ideas for Bitcoin came out of, the cypherpunk ideals of building technology to fight against surveillance. This is so hard incorporated in all of these things. Yes, you have the custodial risk. You should not forget about the custodial risk, but it's still a very useful tool that is really exciting. And yeah, for small payments, if you put in such a small portion of your overall wealth, don't stack your sats in a Fedi or anything. But would I have $50 worth of Bitcoin in a Fedi? Sure, why not? Because then I can go to a conference and buy a meal and split an Uber or whatever. And nobody needs to... It's literally like cash at that point. From me to you, nobody else.
And that's a beautiful thing. Like that is that true implementation of digital cash, but it's only possible when you have the solid foundation. And like that, and so again, I think that's a fair note to wrap up on. But before we wrap up, is there anything else we didn't cover that you wanted to? Is there anything we missed? We covered a lot.
I was kind of expecting that we would touch on covenants just a little bit.
I'm game for it. I mean, I had some other questions too, but we go down various rabbit holes here. Let's touch on covenants if you're down.
Yeah, I don't have to run, so I have a little more time.
Okay.
You have a little kid at home, so maybe you're on the hook for something, but
it's okay. I've got.
You let me know if I have to wrap.
I've got my parents here right now, so they're okay. The most willing babysitters you could imagine. They're like, no, please stay away. Give us more time.
Yeah. So I don't like the term covenants. Let's start with that. Really, I think it's easier to think about what is described as covenant as opcodes that introspect the spending transaction. Like, what a covenant does is it basically looks at the transaction that you use to spend an output, and only under certain conditions, if certain features are present in the spending transaction, it resolves to valid. we have some of those already. We have upcheck sequence verify, we have upcheck lock time verify. So for example, upcheck lock time verify requires that the lock time field on a Bitcoin transaction is set to a certain value, at least a certain value. So we have some of those opcodes already. And basically what all of the proposals, up internal key, up TX hash, up text sig from stack, and so forth, are introducing are other ways of requiring certain features to be present in the transaction that spends an output eventually. I am open to some of these getting merged eventually. I think with the technology that we have right now on chain, we're not going to be able to build that future where everybody can do all of their payments and all of their savings and like just entering and exiting all of the second layer protocols or side chains or whatever people might build or contract. All of that will require a bunch of on-chain capabilities and block space. So we will need more features. Some of those are coming by themselves. Some of them are being built. A lot of them are being discussed. What I'm kind of still missing is I'm just not convinced by any one of those to a degree that I'd say this makes this use case 10x better, or this can build this thing that we couldn't do before that blows me completely out of the water. So while some of these proposals are technically already pretty advanced or well fleshed out, I think that they are still lacking in the narrative department, in the motivation department. Like as you say, if you want people to sail the seas with you, make them long the ocean. Don't drum them up to build a boat with you, right? So I think where we need more work is convince the community that what you're building is going to lead to exceptional improvements in certain use cases or just completely new features that we couldn't do before that are worth all the drama. We have a bit of PTSD from SegWit, I think, with soft forks. What was supposed to be it turned into a multi-year ordeal, and nobody really had anticipated that sort of struggle before. Taproot seemed to me to be pretty well accepted by the developer community very quickly, and also little pushback from the community, and then people created huge drama about how to exactly activate it, which was completely unnecessary in my opinion. So soft forks are more work than people anticipate. For example, specifically with Upcat, it is very impressive what people have come up with, like these very complex constructions, how they can build a vault or something that is sort of like a zero-conf transaction that both on-chain is very complicated, lots of block space, and just has extremely complex scripts that, with Solidity, people have seen that anyone can write Solidity. It's like JavaScript. However, the difficult thing is to write the contract so it does exactly what you intended, nothing else, and reliably what you intended. The difficulty is not in making it accessible so everyone can write it. The difficulty is in writing a good cryptographic protocol. So I feel like Upcat by itself would maybe be a little more of a foot gun, and I don't see the 10x anywhere. Having vaults in general, it would enable vaults, which is something we can't do yet, but most people just do multisig and achieve very similar things. There's a couple scenarios I've been convinced that cannot be solved with multisig that can be introduced with vaults, but I have a hard time getting excited for Upcat so far. So I would I would argue if the people that are heavily pushing for the new opcodes and feel that these are the things that we absolutely need, please invest in the narrative and convince us that what you're building is worth a soft fork. And to that end, I see some discussions on Twitter. I know that there's chat groups in Telegram and so forth. It would really help if a lot of this discussion would end up eventually in more archivable and searchable spaces like Delving Bitcoin, the mailing list, blog posts, or something where if you are only slightly interested and want to keep abreast, you don't have to hunt down these conversations, but you have these points or artifacts that you can consume in order to keep abreast. I think we have a lot to do in the scaling department in the long run if we want this to be the internet cache for everyone. And we will need better tools and cool new ideas. Maybe some of those, 50 proposed layer 2s, some of those might come through and are really cool. Maybe if we get a few opcodes, people can build some really fancy stuff. I hope that we don't cause even more miner centralization, which is one of the things that I'm actually really concerned about breaking the Bitcoin network. Right now, there's just a handful of major hash rate, mining pools or block template creators that control what goes into blocks. It would be way too easy for those people to form a cartel and start a censorship attack. One of the big concerns people have around all of these opcodes is that we might introduce miner extractable value, where we make it too complex for miners to be able to build the optimal block, and therefore introduce new intermediaries, people that build the block for miners, and reduce the number of people that decide what goes into blocks even further, which just creates a central point of failure. Just one door to knock on to decide what can be sent on the Bitcoin network. So, I think that anyone that designs covenants or protocols that make use, now I'm saying covenants myself, new opcodes, people that work on new opcodes, I hope that they keep in mind how that interacts with mining incentives, and they come up with some really 10x or 1,000x improvements, because sure, we can eventually maybe make the block space bigger. Let's make it 10 times bigger. Now we can have 10 million payments instead of 1 million payments per day, but that still doesn't allow us really to do coffee payments on chain. It will blow up the UTXO set even further, which makes it harder to run nodes. I just don't think a small linear factor of increase in capacity is going to be that exciting. So please work a 100x idea and convince us that you can build it. Then I think you'll get a lot of buy-in for your soft fork proposal.
I think that's a great piece of advice. Like if you want people to accept something, make sure that it is orders of magnitude better than what exists right now without sacrificing decentralization and security of the network. And
or trade-offs. I mean, we just talked about trade-offs. Maybe it's less decentralized, but if you can prove that there was no nothing underhanded going on, that might still be perfectly fine, right? Like Arc is super centralized. You have an Arc service provider. They actually have to put up a ton of liquidity, which is one of the things that sort of makes me curious whether it would be able to adopt it, or at least the original Arc proposal. My understanding is that there's new variants that are more scalable or easier to bootstrap, or fedimint, fairly centralized, extremely private. You have trade-offs, right? You can build other stuff on a dumb network. You can build very smart stuff. So, yeah, sorry. You were wrapping up.
I love it. That's a good note to wrap up on. Where do you want to send people? Where should they go to find you? I'll link stuff in the show notes, but also anywhere else you want to send people to just to stay up to date with this stuff.
All right. I have a few. So a few friends of mine and me, we sort of kicked off a Bitcoin mining developer mailing list recently. If you are a developer that works on mining stuff, that might be interesting to join. We talked about that in the recent Bitcoin Uptech recap and newsletter. I think that was last week, so 318. So if you're involved in development surrounding mining, new mailing list. Otherwise, if you have questions on how Bitcoin works technically, I think you'll find a lot of answers on Stack Exchange. If you ask new questions, probably mostly Bitcoin developers or just heavily involved power users and enthusiasts will hopefully quickly respond to you. Please ask away. We could use more good and interesting questions. And yeah, if you want to hear more about Bitcoin development, if you're in a business and need to advise your CEO what's going on in Bitcoin, we cover that every week in the Bitcoin Uptake newsletter and recap. So
I'll drop those in the show notes as well. So
thank you so much.
Absolutely. And Murch, thanks for sharing your scarce time with me. Bitcoin, like your time is scarce, but Bitcoin podcasts are abundant, which I think is a good thing. So thanks for sharing your time with me. It was I learned a lot, and I appreciate your perspective on these things. I think people are going to enjoy this.
Thanks for having me, Walker. I hope I get leverage on my time with all your listeners.
I hope so too. And that's a wrap on this Bitcoin Talk episode of the Bitcoin Podcast. If you are a Bitcoin-only company interested in sponsoring another fucking Bitcoin podcast, head to bitcoinpodcast.net/sponsor. If you're enjoying the Bitcoin Podcast, consider giving the show a 5-star review wherever you listen, or sharing the show with your friends, family, and strangers on the internet. Or don't, Bitcoin doesn't care, but I always appreciate it. You can find me on Nostr by going to primal.net/Walker. If you want to follow the Bitcoin Podcast on Twitter, go to @TitcoinPodcast and @WalkerAmerica. You can also find the video version of this podcast at youtube.com/@WalkerAmerica and @WalkerAmerica on Rumble. Or just go to bitcoinpodcast.net/podcast and find links everywhere. Bitcoin is scarce. There will only ever be 21 million, but Bitcoin podcasts are abundant. So thank you for spending your scarce time to listen to another fucking Bitcoin podcast. Until next time, stay free.